get done the reforms that he really was trying to implement. That didn't work. Carter canned him and appointed this guy, Admiral Stansfield Turner, to reform the CIA. And he was a longtime Navy guy who actually did want to reform the CIA. And in Houston, we'll get into what happened in into the Carter administration for going up against the Bushes. But so remember the Dutch TV producer, TV reporter Willem Altman. So he returned to Dallas in 1977. And Mohrenschildt contacted him, and he began to hint that he was writing something and wanted to tell Altman something troubling. When he first sees Mohrenschildt for the first time in years, he is shocked at how bad it's gotten. Like this guy's he looks haggard. He's paranoid. He used to be a man of some vigor, and it was an active tennis partner, and now he was a fucking complete wreck. And then he starts telling Altman all this shit about how he knew Jack Ruby and was a very compartmentalized part of a plot of Texas oilmen and intelligence operatives to kill John F. Kennedy in Dallas. He begs Altman to take him out of the country, and then Altman takes him to his home in Amsterdam. He puts him up at his house and helps him edit the memoir he's working on called I Am a Patsy, I Am a Patsy, both in exclamation points. This goes fine.
What does that mean?
This goes fine for a couple of days until Altman, keep in mind, himself also somewhat intelligence adjacent, says an old friend who is a Soviet diplomat will be joining them for lunch. The man arrives, and Mohrenschildt said he'd like to take a brief walk, a brief constitutional before lunch. Who doesn't like to do that? So he leaves the house and never returns. He goes to Belgium and then gets a flight back to Florida. And one of the things that was found on him at the scene of his body, on his body, was an affidavit that he had prepared accusing Altman of betraying him. And when you think about this in the context of how George de Mohrenschildt knew Lee Harvey Oswald and the role he played here in Dallas with Mr. Oswald, sort of shepherding him around ex-Russians, and then the whole thing of white Russians, but also the whole thing about Oswald being introduced to arch-conservative anti-communist Russians after being an American who
It's very weird.
went to the Soviet Union to renounce his American citizenship and join a communist country.
Yeah, and then married the daughter of a KGB general, and then he comes home, and it's hey, here are arch reactionaries, hang out with them. And it was cool for some reason.
But just in the context of why he says so this Dutch TV guy is he's losing his mind. He's starting to tell him all this shit about the Kennedy assassination. And then his friend says, oh, I have a friend of mine coming by. He's an ex-Soviet diplomat. You think in George de Mohrenschildt's mind, he began to feel like Oswald, in that all of a sudden you're being placed around Soviet intelligence operatives, you're being placed around Soviets, so that when you end up killing someone or kill yourself, the narrative is credibly presented about your associations and contacts. So he returns to Florida, and the House Select Committee on Assassination learns of this and sends one of their investigators to interview him. A man named, this is not made up, one of the coolest names ever, Gaeton Fonzie. Gaeton Fonzie. He learns that Gaeton Fonzie is on the way to interview him while he is being interviewed by Edward J. Epstein, no relation, of Reader's Digest magazine. He kills himself later that afternoon. And then he blows his head off with a shotgun. And then the other part about that story I really love is that in Bill O'Reilly's book, Killing Kennedy, he invents a story about how when he was a TV producer here in Dallas, he found out that Mohrenschildt had returned to the United States and he claims he found at the house he was staying at, and he says that he was knocking on the door going, "Come out, Pinhead!" as the guy put a shotgun in his mouth and blew his head off. I just think he killed himself because he didn't want to talk to Bill O'Reilly.
Well, that's the funny thing. It's that's the story you're telling. It's yeah, this guy blew his head off instead of talk to me.
There's just one last detail about the circumstances of his suicide. The shotgun that he used to kill himself was placed in the guest room that he was staying in by the proprietor of the house. A loaded shotgun was placed in his bedroom because she said she heard strange noises the other night. I mean, whatever, it's Texas, I buy it. There's basically there's this whole constellation of people that the FBI investigated after the George de Mohrenschildt suicide, including a guy named Jim Savage, who was an executive at Transcontinental Drilling Company, who knew both Poppy and George de Mohrenschildt. Jim Savage was someone who Mohrenschildt gave his car to drive from the airport back home. He'd worked with Mohrenschildt, and he'd also been a friend and colleague. He worked for a company called Kerr-McGee, who was for the Senator Robert Kerr, who was a colleague of Prescott Bush. In 1952, Savage gave Poppy Bush a tour of Kerr-McGee before he started Zapata Petroleum. And wouldn't you know it, the Kerr-McGee Oil Company was very instrumental in setting up George Bush very nicely in the oil business. Jim Savage's supervisor at Kerr-McGee was a guy named George Kitchell, who was also good friends with Poppy and helped him launch his political career in Houston in the early 1960s. Years after the assassination, Kitchell confirmed that he was friends with both Poppy and Mohrenschildt, but he didn't know that the other two knew each other. Don't you hate it when, friends of friends? But check this out. Here's the last thing I'm going to drop through tonight. This is just the last weird connection here. George Kitchell's brother was the FBI agent that Poppy George H.W. Bush called on November 22nd, 1963, to warn him about threats made on Kennedy's life here in Dallas. So this was part of creating his backstory. This cover here, it was about right-wing groups that were making death threats to Kennedy in Dallas. So he was like, day of, he was like, oh shit, let me just contact my good friend's brother who works for the FBI and just get this story on the record real quick. So that is part 1 of part 3 of Poppy. Dallas, Texas. We are going to take a quick break. We're going to have a quick intermission. Please get a drink. Please tip your bartenders. We'll be back in the second half with Texas Boys Pendejo Time. We got Jake and Thomas with us tonight. So chill out. We'll be back in a little bit. So that's enough about Dallas. Fuck Dallas, right? Let's get it going. Let's talk about Poppy Bush's connections to the city of Houston. So Poppy leaves the CIA in 1977. After a very brief tenure, and of course he begged Jimmy Carter to let him stay on to continue the important work he was doing. So he leaves government and goes back to the old family business, banking. But he does it here in Texas. He is hired as a special consultant to the First International Bank Shares of Dallas, which was at the time Texas's largest bank holding company. Under his reign, FIB acquired 50 banks and was only turned down by the Federal Reserve one time. Quick side note, First International Bank Shares of Dallas is owned by close family friends of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. 14 months after being hired as a special consultant, FIB went bankrupt and was bailed out by the government for $3.5 billion. But let's talk about another Texas bank, Main Bank of Houston. It's a small, charming community bank with only about $58 million in deposits, which was, between October 1978 and December 1979, buying $10.4 million a month in new $100 bills. Main Bank of Houston is notable here for 2 reasons. One, because the principal investors was one of the principal investors was a Bush family crony by the name of Jim Bath. He was a guy who met and befriended George W. Bush during their service together in Vietnam in the Air National Guard. But 2, and probably most importantly, it was the first time a joint Texan-Saudi banking partnership was done publicly. Just 2 months after Poppy became CIA director, Jim Bath started an aircraft brokerage firm. And he became acquainted with, because they wanted to buy planes from him, 2 scions of 2 very wealthy Saudi families, the Bin Mahfouzes and, of course, the Bin Ladens. The principal investors in Main Bank of Houston were Jim Bath, Khalid bin Mahfouz, another Saudi named Gaith Farron, and one more guy, former Texas Governor John Connally. So I just like to think about this sorry about getting you shot, John, but here's a really sweet banking job I've got lined up for you after that magic bullet went through your wrist. Reading here from Family of Secrets, what most distinguished the tiny Main Bank was the highly unusual amount of cash the bank dispersed, more than $10 million a month in $100 bills. The authorities often consider such untraceable money flows to be signs of criminal activity, particularly money laundering, often connected with drugs. Cash, however, is also the principal tool of covert operations.
Students of history will note that this bank is operating in the same time frame as Saudi intelligence is ramping up its Wahhabization policy. of dumping maybe some of those fresh $100 bills in hotspots around the world where U.S. and Saudi enemies exist.
Main Bank of Houston, however, was merely a minnow compared to the Leviathan known as the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or the world's sleaziest bank. Khalid bin Mahfouz owned 20% of BCCI, and Gaith Farron, one of the principal investors in Main Bank of Houston, was understood to be their front man in the United States. BCCI was founded in the early 70s and shuttered in 1991. But forgotten now, for a time, was probably the biggest financial fraud and criminal conspiracy in human history. Reading more from Russ Baker, he describes it as a vast entity connected to the Pakistani military regime and key Gulf states, with banks and branches in 73 countries, including 50 developing ones. Although its founder, Agha Hassan Abedi, along with his top brass, emphasized their Muslim religiosity, the institution would apparently do anything for anyone willing to pay for their services needed to be kept quiet. These ranged from helping Pakistan obtain a nuclear bomb to financing secret arms deals on behalf of the West, while simultaneously serving as a money distribution network for many terrorist organizations. Some of their most famous clients include Saddam Hussein, terrorist mastermind Abu Nidal, Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, and the elusive heroin kingpin of Asia's Golden Triangle, Kun Sa.
Some real Noriega.
I didn't know he had
heads in
some.
the audience.
I didn't know he had so many Noriega heads in the audience tonight.
Abu Nidal, probably the biggest loser in that list. He pops up again in another Poppy-related thing when Oliver North is testifying before Congress on Iran-Contra, and they ask him why he has all this cash, why he took all this money, and he starts fake crying and says that Abu Nidal threatened to kill him, so he needed to buy a home security system.
Despite having, and this is how evil this bank truly is, despite having a murderer's row of star banking clients, which also included Mossad, the MI6, and CIA, most of the deposits, most of the funding was actually from ordinary people in developing countries, particularly in the form of remissions from guest workers from the Philippines working in Gulf countries. And when BCCI collapsed, millions of their patrons, many of whom were guest workers, lost what little they had of their life savings. Now, by 1988, in the last year of Poppy's reign as vice president, the Manhattan DA, Robert Morgenthau, informed the City of London, where BCCI was chartered, that he was seeking to indict it as a Ponzi scheme. In order to avoid a run on the bank and MI6, the Bank of England closed BCCI. Now, almost every attempt by multiple countries to unravel the extent of this criminal empire ran into a wall called national security. Investigating it would simply compromise the secrets of their clients, aka the Pakistani military, the Mossad, CIA, and MI6. The man in charge of investigating BCCI in America, that's right, Robert Mueller. Would it surprise you to learn that his investigation turned up no evidence of the US government enabling this vast criminal conspiracy? If he had looked a little harder, though, he might have found records of meetings between the BCCI's founder, Abedi, and at the time, Reagan CIA Director William Casey. Journalists alleged dozens of meetings between the two and alleged that they struck a deal to make BCCI the major conduit for covert operations. It was the way to launder millions of dollars in funds that had not been authorized by Congress. Another way around the old church committee. And here's another little thing. The guy in charge of regulating BCCI, when people believed it was just a bank and not a criminal conspiracy, the Assistant Secretary for Enforcement under the Reagan-Bush administration was a man named John Walker, Poppy's cousin, George H.W. Bush's cousin. So here's where it gets good. So we talked about how he had a hand in stitching up Kennedy and Nixon. But keep in mind, he was out of office at this point and was very sore at the fact that Jimmy Carter and the Democrats had taken the White House, which is always the real prize. And not only that, Jimmy Carter had appointed a guy named Stansfield Turner to be the director of the CIA, who genuinely was an outsider to the intelligence community. So here's what he does. He basically ensnares the people connected to him ensnare the director of Carter's Office of Budget Management and Budget in a banking scandal, and they would use it in their effort to retake the White House in 1980. The guy named Burt Lance was Carter's OMB director. And around early in the Carter administration, the Senate began looking into a dodgy bank loan he got to ensure compliance with the terms of a stock purchase in the Bank of Georgia. I'm sorry, this is very dry. We're talking about banking here, but this is Houston. This is Houston. This is all of these are Dallas and Houston. Okay, there's banks everywhere in this country. So, because of that scandal, Burt Lance resigns in 1977, and that's where Poppy and his friends step in. Lance is out of work and broke as shit. So imagine his surprise when Aga Hassan Abedi and Gaith Farron are interested in buying Lance's bank stock, which was okay because Lance had already been approved by American regulators. Lance, of course, enthusiastically agreed and essentially became the unwitting middleman for the introduction of the BCCI into the American banking system. So if anyone investigated this, Lance's name would be front and center and not far off from his friend and former business partner, Jimmy Carter. So you begin to see why Carter's attempts to open up the books on the CIA went absolutely nowhere. Also, little known fact, Jimmy Carter's idiot brother was also involved in an arms deal with Gaddafi and was given classified intelligence by Brzezinski, Mika's dad, Zbigniew. So this is really what takes us from the end of Nixon to the beginning of the Reagan administration. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Poppy Part 3.